see a full room here this afternoon. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our invitational lecturer this afternoon. Carol Anderson is an associate professor of African American Studies and History at Emory University and a specialist in public policy, especially the intersections of domestic and international politics toward issues of race, justice, and equality in the United States. Professor Anderson earned her BA and MA at Miami University, where she specialized in political science, international relations, and history, and where she was also elected into Phi Beta Kappa. Then she enrolled here at Ohio State, where she earned her PhD in the field of U.S. foreign relations, studying with Michael Hogan and yours truly. Professor Anderson is the author of Eyes Off the Prize, the United Nations and the African American Struggle for Human Rights, 1944 to 1955, published by Cambridge University Press, and the winner of both the Gustavus Myers Outstanding Book Award and the Myrna F. Bernath Book Award, as well as a finalist for 2 other competitions. Last month, Cambridge just published Professor Anderson's newest book entitled Bourgeois Radicals, the NAACP and the Struggle for Colonial Liberation, 1941 to 1960, which examines the roles of that venerable organization in the campaign for the liberation of peoples of color in Asia and Africa. Professor Anderson's research has been sponsored by the ACLS, the Ford Foundation, the National Humanities Center, the Charles Warren Center at Harvard, the Committee on Institutional Cooperation, and the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. She's also served as the visiting Gladstein Professor of Human Rights at the University of Connecticut and as a consultant for the Center at the Center for Applied Science and Behavioral Studies at Stanford, the Aspen Institute, and the United Nations. She's also been a member of the U.S. Department of State's Historical Advisory Committee, the Board of Directors of the Harry Truman Library Institute, and the Board of the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative. Professor Anderson has received numerous teaching awards, I dare say far more than anyone else I know of. Emory has decorated her with the Crystal Apple Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching in 2011, as well as numerous honorable citations for mentoring undergraduate honors theses. In her previous appointment at the University of Missouri, Professor Anderson won the Mizzou Class of '39 Outstanding Teaching Award twice, in 2009 and 2005, the Maxine Christopher Schutz Distinguished Teaching Award in 2006, the Department of Athletics MVP Award, that's Most Valuable Professor, in 2003, the William T. Kemper Fellowship for Teaching Excellence in 2001, the Provost Teaching Award for Outstanding Junior Faculty, and the Gold Chalk Award for Outstanding Graduate Teaching, both in 2000. Today, Professor Anderson will present a paper entitled The Danger of the Single Story, African Americans' Anti-Colonialism in the Early Cold War, after which she will field your questions. Please join me in welcoming her here.
Thank you. It feels really good to be back home. I grew up just about a mile that way, and so on big football days we could hear the roar in the stadium. So I'm home. So thank you for inviting me. I wanted to start off with a story, because I'm a storyteller. And so about 2 years ago, my brother sent me a YouTube clip, because he said, oh, this is right up something you would love. And it was Chimamanda Adichie's The Danger of the Single Story. And in that danger of the single story, she talked about as a child how all she did, she read novels, lots of British novels and lots of American novels, and she just loved those novels. And then she would start writing, and what she was writing about, she would write about blondes eating apples in the snow. And her mother looked at us as a child. You realize we're in Nigeria, right? and Chimamanda was like, but the people that were in those novels, for her, those were the people who were supposed to be in the novels. Because that's what she saw. Blondes eating apples in the snow. But what this parable was really about is that when we consistently get a single story It so flattens and constricts the complexity of the world. And so she talked about, for instance, Africa is poor. Immigrants are Mexican and illegal. The poor don't work. Those stories are so flattened without the complexity that needs to be there, that we hear them over and over and over again, that they're almost said without interrogation. Well, I started reflecting on that, and I realized that I too, about a mile down this way, grew up with a single story. And it was the story of what authentic black leadership looked like. And that leadership was usually overtly militant. It had swag, not swagger, swag. And frankly, it usually wore leather. But like Adichie, I eventually grew up and I realized that the world was much more complex. But what has happened is that in the literature for African Americans anti-colonialism, this literature base has not grown up. Instead, what we get, what I call the romance of the radical. And what it has done is it has erased the role of black liberals from colonial liberation struggles. Right now, we get a powerful story arc that goes from Marcus Garvey to Du Bois, to Robeson, to Malcolm, to SNCC, to Panthers. But in so doing, in elevating the incredible work of these radicals, we have not just excavated, but we have elevated to the point where we have diminished the role of where most African Americans were, because most African Americans were not radical. They wanted freedom. And the way that scholars have written out liberals has been with a few terse words that have put them back on the plantation. Uncle Tom of the African Revolution. I am a handkerchief head. And in so doing, just with a few terse words, we get a single story that erases black liberals from colonial liberation struggles. But I believe that this interpretation, this lens, is too narrow. It has funneled the very definition of real black leadership into a straitjacket of thought that puts an incredible value on militancy and resistance, overt militancy and resistance. And those hold iconic value in the black community, while depicting as sellouts and toms those who have an abiding faith in the idea of America and American democracy, and who have worked assiduously to turn that potential of freedom into a reality. So the story that I'm going to tell is one of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And the NAACP took on this struggle for colonial liberation, although the literature since 1971 says that it did not. The NAACP's agenda was consistent, both before and after the start of the Cold War. Working with indigenous leaders, the NAACP came up with, you have got to have indigenous control of natural resources. You have got to have an educational system so that the people can run their own government and their own systems. You must have a viable healthcare system so that your people are well, because it is really hard to have a viable democracy if people are sick. You must have labor standards, because it has been the exploitation of labor that has been one of the hallmark elements in colonial exploitation. Labor standards removes that. You protect the workers. And you must have land reform. This is the NAACP's platform in this anti-colonial agenda. It argued that without this complement, and this is a complement of human rights, without this complement of human rights, what you're doing is that you are in fact creating a cycle of repression and violence and war and repression and violence and war, because when human rights are not honored, then in fact you have left people vulnerable and desperate. To break that silence and to create viable regimes, these are the components that have to be in place. Now, this wasn't just the NAACP theorizing. They mapped it out. I call it, in the book, I call it like looking at a Jenga tower and figuring out what propped up colonialism, what made it viable, what gave this thing legitimacy, what gave it the thing that made colonial power say, I have an empire. Well, my empire is bigger than your empire, right? So what did that? And so the NAACP is looking at it the same way they looked at Jim Crow to say, how do you destabilize this thing? And they began to pull out these key pillars. Several of those pillars. One of those pillars dealt with issues of international accountability, and I'm going to spend some time on that one today. International accountability. If you're going to hold a colony, you need to be able to say in front of the entire world exactly what you're doing in that colony. And if you cannot justify what you have done, then something is really wrong with the way that what you're doing. The other piece that they looked at is you had to honor the wishes of the inhabitants. The indigenous people had the right to determine what their government would look like. And if you did not honor the wishes of the inhabitants, you had no right to rule. That's the tack that they took in what I call the Italian colonies issue. The next piece that they looked at was what was called domestic jurisdiction. One of the things that the colonial powers always talked about was that they had domestic jurisdiction, sovereignty over the colonies. So in the battle with Indonesia, what the NAACP argued was, so how is it that in the Netherlands you control Indonesia when the Indonesians say you have no right to govern us? Looking at domestic jurisdiction, do you have the right to sovereignty when the people refuse to accept your rule? So pulling on those key elements that propped up colonialism, the NAACP, working with an array of other organizations and with indigenous leaders, went after colonialism and the white man's burden. One of the major test cases was South Africa. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And it's with the colony, what was then, it was a mandate of Southwest Africa, current day Namibia. Now, Southwest Africa was a mandate. It had originally been a German colony. And when Germany got a hold of it, the indigenous people were just like, And the Hereros went to war. The Germans, in a genocidal campaign, wiped out 80% of the Hereros, 50% of the Namas, and 50% of the Bergdamaras. This is in the early 20th century. After the First World War, under the League of Nations, they created the mandate system and said, we will treat these colonies as a sacred trust of civilization. Now that sounds great, doesn't it? That sounds good. There's a problem with that though. As a sacred trust of civilization, then the League of Nations turned over Southwest Africa to South Africa in order to be the administering power. Now, this is pre-apartheid South Africa, but rest assured, white supremacy is all up in the marrow of the governing operating principles of South Africa. And so the League of Nations has now put a sacred trust of civilization with Africans under the domain of a white supremacist regime. When the Second World War came and the United Nations is created, and under the United Nations is created a trusteeship program. And basically, all of the mandates are put under this trusteeship program under the League. South Africa had another idea. South Africa said, you know, we've thought about it, and we've decided we're going to annex Southwest Africa and make it the 5th province of South Africa. Now, this is right after the Second World War, where you have had Hitler annexing. And so when Jan Christian Smuts, the head of South Africa, goes to the UN at the very first meeting and says, we're going to annex, okay? And the UN looks up, and particularly led by Peter Fraser of New Zealand, and he says, absolutely not. There is nothing in the charter, in our goals, that is about annexation. Absolutely not. Now, South Africa didn't expect that kind of brushback pitch. The vote was something like 37-7 against. This was not a vote that South Africa expected. And so Jan Christian Smuts comes back at the next meeting, and he says, don't worry. I know you had some concerns, but we held a referendum. And in this referendum, 100% of the Europeans in Southwest Africa want to be annexed. Now, I want you to just take a minute. If you got 2 people in the room, it's going to be really hard to get 100%. 35,000 agreed, 100%, that they wanted to be annexed. Already, this is looking suspect. Then he added, 85%